Welcome to Cycle 3 of Investigating Science, Module 7 and 8. First, we're going to start with our do now. So I want you to see if you recognize this person. And if you do recognize him, why have they caused so much controversy around the world and in the scientific community? So pause this now and see if you and your classmates can identify this person. So hopefully somebody in your group was able to identify this person as Pete Evans, who was on My Kitchen Rules, and he has caused some controversy for his comments about paleo dieting, knowing that he is involved in food, but not necessarily from a scientific background. So he caused a lot of controversy for the comments he made about those diets. So we're looking at 2 inquiry questions in this cycle. So how do science-related events affect society's view of science? And also, why is scientific research regulated? We are going to start with a small section on the halo effect and pseudoscience, and you'll see that we've broken up our lesson into 5 different parts because there are a few different, syllabus outcomes that we're addressing in this cycle. So firstly, let us look at the halo effect. So it's a psychological phenomenon where a person is perceived more favorably because of an initial positive perception of that person. So if the person is well presented, has an honest reputation, we think they're quite trustworthy, often they are used to support a product or a service or an opinion, even if they have no training in the efficacy or the service or any knowledge in regards to that. So we have some examples here, but the idea of using a celebrity to endorse a viewpoint, whether it's to sell a product or whether it's to support a scientific debate, this can change a person's perception depending on how they think of that celebrity. Next is pseudoscience. So it's a practice that portrays itself as science, even though it doesn't actually meet any scientific research criteria. So some examples that we're looking at here is astrology, numerology, and iridology. So the investigations in these fields don't actually meet any of the scientific investigation requirements. They're not repeatable, even though they're perceived as being based on scientific evidence. So we have astrology, the idea of star signs. So it has complex terminology and it's processes like this which show us some kind of scientific information, but it is a very old pseudoscience and it is practiced and believed by many people and cultures around the world. The next example is numerology, the idea that numbers play a role in how we, will perceive our behavior and the actions and things that we may see coming up in our future. And then iridology, the idea that we can look at a person's iris, and depending on what we see in that iris, we're able to diagnose them with some, health issues. Which we can see here looking at our irises. We can see if we notice patterns in different parts of the eye that we'll be able to, diagnose them with some kind of issue. So there are 2 tasks related to this information. So we're just going to do some definitions and examples of the halo effect, and then we're going to do some reading about the different types of pseudoscience, which are covered previously in this video, but they go into a bit more detail. The next has got to do with the public image of science, and there are a few that we're going to have to go through that are outlined in the syllabus. So the first is the meltdown of nuclear reactors. So nuclear reactors are used to generate energy through nuclear fission. And the idea behind nuclear fission was that it enables electricity to be generated with the absence of greenhouse gas emissions. So I guess it is the way moving forward to not contribute to that pollution. But even though it is quite beneficial, when it was first produced, scientists didn't actually see or predict the implications that it might have if anything actually went wrong with the reactor itself. So the example that we know is Chernobyl in 1986. So there was a few different reasons why that meltdown happened. Some of it is due to the reactor design. Some of it was due to insufficient staff training and communication. And then there was also a failure in following safety regulations. So there was a large explosion and release of toxic products into the atmosphere. So it's a buildup of pressure that resulted in that explosion. And we can see that has lasting impacts for Chernobyl and the residents who used to live there and also of the land moving forward. So I guess short-term implications. So people living within 30 kilometres of the nuclear plant site were relocated. And it placed a large pressure on healthcare systems. A large number of people suffered acute radiation syndrome, and anyone who worked at the power plant that did survive lost their income, and also anyone who worked on the land in agriculture was unable to obviously continue working there. And then long-term implications. So radioactive products were spread to over 30 countries. The radioactive compounds were accumulated in food and water sources in the area. And obviously healthcare, it wasn't just the immediate pressure, but there was a long-term pressure of people who required treatment for radiation exposure. And then there were ongoing threats to the agricultural industry in that area. So iodine was actually present in milk, making it radioactive. Even though the cows were able to survive in that area, their milk products were not viable for sale. So there are a couple of questions here in task 3. So just a quick summary. There is another video that will go into more detail, and that's where these 25 questions are related to. And then there is a HSC question here about the nuclear reactor. It is a HSC question, so you can find the marking criteria uploaded on the Google Classroom once you've had a go on your own. The next is the development of the smallpox vaccine. So obviously vaccination in this day and age is used to establish immunity to a specific disease. So we know vaccines either contain a weakened form of the antigen or an artificial antigen that stimulates the immune response to the production of antibodies. So a long time passed between the first attempt to vaccinate and then the modern vaccines that we see today. They're continuously a subject of social debate. Even though we have scientific evidence that proves their safety, it continues to polarize people and their opinions around it. Smallpox was one of the first infectious diseases to be eradicated globally, and the pressure of smallpox epidemics put a large pressure on healthcare facilities and obviously generated lots of fear in the community. And other lacks of available treatment sparked scientific investigation into vaccines. So the person who we look at when we're looking in terms of vaccines is Edwin Jenner, who was responsible for, our first smallpox vaccine, but he was dealing with cowpox. So what he observed was that milkmaids who had consumed milk from cows who had cowpox didn't appear to be affected by any symptoms of smallpox. So using the pus from the pustules, he inserted it into the incision on an 8-year-old's arm, and this was followed by exposure to smallpox with no symptoms being seen. So I guess in this circumstance, originally the vaccine, the development of it was quite unethical. The fact that we would inoculate somebody with a disease, not actually knowing whether the process he'd used in terms of his assumption of the observation, we didn't actually know whether it would work. So in this case, it was considered quite unethical for Edward Jenner to do what he did. But we now know with lots of then trials and scientific investigation that what he was in fact doing was how common vaccinations are used today. So he actually practiced this experiment on his son as well, which we know is quite unethical. But over time, due to the scientific investigation, there was a dramatic decline in those suffering from the disease. So the success of the smallpox program led the way for the eradication of other diseases such as polio and reduced cases of whooping cough. So in terms of the timeline of smallpox, in 1967, a long time after Edward Jenner had looked at smallpox and that cowpox continuum, we see that the World Health Organization introduced the smallpox eradication program. And in 1980, 13 years after the first program was established, we see smallpox was declared as being eradicated. So a lot of social implications, they place less strain on hospitals and reduces the taxpayer expenses for treating the disease. So I guess quite a preventative measure. So there is another video on the smallpox vaccine, so pause the video and complete task 4. Next is our task 5 and our development of flight. So inventors believe that aeroplanes were able to fly long distances in a fraction of the time. And the idea that domestic and international travel is quite essential for coordinating and managing our developed society. So The Wright brothers in 1900 built a glider kite to test their ideas. And finally, in 1905, they actually perfected their original design. And we know that Flyer 3 was able to fly for 39 minutes. So I guess some of the impacts around that it allowed for globalization, and transporting and our military operations. So there are quite a few different ways in which flight increased the public image. So originally quite unsafe, and also I guess really kept for people who could afford it, because it was quite expensive at the beginning of flight. But then as we started to see more aeroplanes being developed, and more flights going around the world, it decreased that idea that was for the upper class, and that all people were able to fly around the world. So we can look at some of the different questions here. And then there is a HSC question that is about flight. So there also is a marking criteria uploaded on the Google Classroom for when you've attempted this question. The next has got to do with damming rivers. So damming rivers we can look at from both a positive and negative perspective. So the idea of damming is blocking a river or a stream using a large wall to in fact keep the water in a dam, which is a large body of water. So the first Australian dam was built in Victoria in 1850, and in New South Wales, dams supply the water we need for agriculture, irrigation, our domestic supply, and public recreation. There are some dams which generate hydroelectricity, but we don't have a lot of these in Australia. So I guess some benefits. The idea that we can have extra household water and supply agricultural areas with water, and also I guess the forms of recreation. And then we know that hydroelectricity generates clean and renewable energy that does not produce greenhouse gases. In terms of limitations and some negative effects of damming waterways is that it alters the free flow of waterways. So organisms have adapted to how much of different, I guess, abiotic factors are present in the water. And by altering and trapping that in a dam, it changes the ecosystem, which can result in a loss of biodiversity. By disconnecting rivers from other waterways, it prevents, I guess, this loss of biodiversity, but can also, on the flip side, create overpopulation due to a smaller ecosystem, and then organisms lower in the food chain are in large supply. And I guess blocking the waterway, which is stopping the natural processes from happening. So there are a few different case studies which you can use in your defense of the public image of damming rivers. So more recently, the idea of the mismanagement of Warragamba Dam leading to floods. In 2018, there was a case study on the Murray-Darling mismanagement, so the major loss of biodiversity. The idea that the last dam was built in Australia in 1984, even though we've seen a large growth in our population. The debate between New South Wales residents and the government in terms of raising the wall. And in the Amazon rainforest, dams are being built for electricity, but it's ruining the landscape and the people who live on those lands. So pause this now to finish task 6, which again has another HSC question, which has a marking criteria in your Google Classroom. Next, we're moving on to our last section of our cycle, which is the regulation of scientific research. So there are different international scientific codes of conduct that allow scientists to, perform under a uniform set of rules from an international perspective. So on one case, this allows society to have, a baseline set of regulation, but then because it is an international code, each country then is able to enact their own country's code, which can be beneficial or harmful depending on where it is and what they are doing. So in terms of biotechnology, we're going to try and use a few different Australian examples here of how we've interpreted the international codes, but the Medical Technology Association of Australia works with the federal government. In terms of stem cell research, the International Society of Stem Cell Research sets the international standards. Surrogacy is something that we've interpreted in Australia very differently to how they've interpreted it across the world. So we have the Commonwealth Government's Surrogacy Matters Inquiry, which has republished the regulatory and legislative aspects of surrogacy. The NHMRC published their 2016 document, Ethical Guidelines for Organ Transplantation for Deceased Donors. And for gene technology, it's regulated by the Gene Technology Act in relation to the establishment of the Interim Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, which acts within the TGA, so the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia. So here we have a few examples of how Australia has interpreted the international scientific code. So we see about embryos here in terms of the cloning regulations, and then we see the surrogacy. Even though there is a national legislation in Australia for surrogacy, each domestic jurisdiction has been able to interpret their own. So in some states, it varies as to how we're implementing the national code, which is also then its own interpretation of the international code. So some of this is a research task. You'll see there are some links here in terms of the legislation. So we're looking at how the legislation impacts the research and the practice, so the way in which we use these in society. So have a look. We're going to complete this as a collaborative research. We're going to look at the legislation or the code of conduct and put in some detail about how the research is regulated and then how it is regulated in practice. And so we're also going to then start practicing our writing, and using the evaluate scaffold that we see here, we're going to look at the effectiveness of international regulation. And so some of the guiding questions you see here, you may want to discuss in your answer. An evaluate question, we will want to write in paragraph form that elaborates on our idea, providing statements and our examples to back up our opinion, and then make sure that in an evaluation, we're making a judgment for either side of the argument. Next, we have the impacts of scientific research devices and application on world health and human well-being, and there are three that we're going to look at. We're going to look at medical surgical devices, medical, surgery techniques, and then we're going to look at wastewater and water purification. So in terms of medical surgical devices, they have been developed to support human health and well-being by reducing pain and recovery time. It is expected to, by 2023, that the global market for medical devices will reach $640 billion. So this is grown by advancements across a wide range of fields, including robotics and nuclear medicine. We see three examples here. Lots are related to the heart and how we have, devices that are minimally invasive, reduce time that it's taken to recover, and ensuring that a person's health and overall well-being is improved. So what is important here is for you to start a brainstorm about the positive and negative sides. So I guess in positive sides, we got things like less recovery time, that a person's overall well-being will be improved by not being in hospital for a large amount of time. On the downside is that it is quite a new procedures, that it relies on the doctor that you're working with to want to undertake these kind of innovative treatments, and also the access to these. So depending on whether you're, in the inner city or regional areas, will depend on whether you will have access to these kind of technologies, that they may be more expensive and not be covered by Medicare if they're innovative, as opposed to other procedures that would be. So there's quite a few different positive and negatives for using these, and I guess their impacts can be both positive and negative. So using this link here, make sure that you look up a few examples that you know and are able to use in an answer. And then again, we're using the evaluate scaffold. So we want to evaluate the impact. So we want to make sure we have positives and negatives, and then are able to make an overall judgment about whether their impact, how we would feel about that. Is it overall a positive impact? The next we move on to surgical procedures. So lots of the benefits that we see with these surgical procedures are also the ones that we see within the medical surgical devices. So the procedures we're moving a lot more towards minimally invasive. So in terms of being able to have an operation and then return to a normal quality of life following the operation, reduced healing time, less wounds in terms of this pelvic laparoscopy used here. So I guess it would be that camera technology, being able to understand what is happening. And you can see here that instead of cutting open, we see just 3 keyhole marks here. So I guess in terms of a person's well-being, less scars would help a person to feel better about themselves. So we are going to have that be a positive impact on a person's well-being. And we see here less pain, shorter post-operative hospitalization, and minimizing the risk of infection. So again, make sure that you find a couple of examples in the research department to make sure that you have a few examples that you'd be confident to use. And again, using the evaluate scaffold. And then the last is water purification and wastewater treatment. So I guess there are 2 aspects to this research. So we're talking about wastewater in terms of water that has been used in domestic, commercial, agricultural settings, stormwater, and being able to reuse this again. So it must go through a series of processes to try and purify it. And we see here that this is quite summarized here, but the idea of coagulation and flocculation and sedimentation and that filtration. So I guess the process of making sure that there are no particles of dirt, bits of gunk and grime and rubbish, making sure all of those are removed. And we're moving down the filtration areas where we get some smaller filtration coming down. So up until that point, we probably are still seeing some microorganisms and viruses present in the water. And then that's when we move to our disinfection, where we have the ability to try and remove those from the water. So then we end up with treated water. So in terms of that process, it requires a lot of industrial setup. So making sure that there are treatment plants that are able to do this. So I guess if we're talking bigger picture, third world countries may not have access to this. But in terms of the input of money and then the access to clean water, we have to weigh up the pros and cons of both of those. And then in terms of water purification, so hopefully people have heard about the life straw device, which enables people to get water, and then by drinking through the straw, it will remove lots of the bacteria and protozoa and lots of the things that may be able to cause people to be ill from drinking untreated water, so that it enables them to, I guess, overall health and well-being is increased. So there are also lots of other ways to purify water, and there's a few other processes you can look at in terms of wastewater treatment. So make sure you summarize those by doing a little bit more of your own research and then using our evaluate scaffold to finish that as well. That concludes our really large cycle 3. Make sure that you update your inquiry log and practice the Google form questions, which do have a lot of HSC questions. This is one of the topics that there are quite a lot of questions present in both the previous HSC exams that allow a person to elaborate on their understanding of these concepts.